I'm Rachel Woody, part of the Linfield College Archives, and we're here today for the Word and Wine History Project on the Latino IPNC 2013 exhibit. I'm here with Susan Sokol Blosser of Sokol Blosser Winery, and we're here to ask her a few questions specifically for Salud and Latino vineyard workers. And I have with me Julian Adolph and Lydia Hines. Thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of the interview.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for taking on this topic, which I think is really important.
Yes, it's definitely something that we've been hearing a lot over the last couple of years. And so let's start there, actually. For you, what is part of the story that we should make sure that we're capturing and telling?
Well, the Latino workers really started for us, I think, in the 1980s. Up till then, we used high school students. And I mean, it's been interesting when you look at what's happened with the labor force. It used to be that kids growing up in farm country in this area earned money, spent their teenage years picking strawberries and doing other things, and it was kind of a ritual to go through the very difficult, hands on your knees picking strawberry process. But then child labor laws kicked in, and they were cut out unless they were older. And the Hispanic population started to take up the slack. And when we had cherries, the workers would come in and pick the cherries. We never had strawberries, but we have found that the Hispanic workers were much more reliable. We had to train the high school kids who came, who we would find sitting down on the job and, spending their time just talking to each other, and didn't have the work ethic that the Latino population has, that is really so admirable and has been really responsible in many ways for the success of the Oregon wine industry. Grapes, as I'm sure you've heard many times, are extremely labor dependent, hand labor dependent. There are some things you can do by tractor, but most things you have to do by hand, and we go through at Sokol Blosser, down each row, tending each vine, probably more than 10 times during the course of the year, doing things like rubbing off the shoots when the Pinot Noir, because they tend to put out so many shoots when they're young, cutting the suckers off the base of the plant, cutting the crop, putting up catch wires so that they grow straight up. And this is in addition to pruning and pulling the wood off the wire and harvesting. There's just a lot of things to help the Pinot Noir vines grow the way we want them to grow. Mm-hmm. So we are totally dependent on hand labor to do that. And we feel very lucky that we have a Latino population with a good work ethic that is willing to do that.
For the Latinos that have come to join the Sokol Blosser crew, have you found that they already have a lot of the agricultural skill? And for example, we've heard a lot of them come up through California, so perhaps they already had some Napa Valley experience. Is that the case?
Well, what we have found is that the ones that we know the best have come through California, but not necessarily with grapes. So let me give you two examples. One is a woman that I have so much admiration for. Her name is Ophelia Galavez, and I hope you will be interviewing her. She worked with us in the 1980s especially, and during that time I was managing the vineyard, so I was out in the vineyards every day. So I worked with her a lot, and I had my own little crew. At that time, she was the only Latino in the crew, but she and her husband at that time, who was a contractor, worked with us pruning, and then she worked with us over the course of the year. Ophelia had come up from California, had been a migrant with different crops, and she and her first husband settled in the Dayton community. She had 11 children. And her children went on to become, I mean, this is really a beautiful story, went on to become a doctor in the Kaiser Health, a nurse and an attorney. I mean, some of them also had problems, but, you know, out of 11, she had some real high achievers. She was the most beautiful woman, I think. When I think of Ophelia, she's now in her 80s, but when I think of her in her prime and her beautiful dark hair and beautiful face and flashing eyes. She had the beauty of a flamenco dancer. And she would come to work for us. We'd spend the day pruning, but we'd sit around at lunch and she would happen to mention how she had gotten up that morning and made tortillas for the family. I mean, these are homemade tortillas. I'm not talking about putting one on the griddle. She made them from scratch. She tended the chickens, you know, and then she'd go home and work with her children or grandchildren. That's a work ethic that is just leaves me tired just hearing about it. So she was really wonderful, and she worked with her second husband, Frank, until he ran off with a younger woman. So she is, as far as I know, she's still living in Dayton, but she was really, and she became an American citizen as well. So the other story I have, and I hope you get to interview him as well, is Manuel Hernandez, who we call Luis, and he came up from Mexico as well and went to, worked his way up. I think one of his jobs was watering flowers at a graveyard. I mean, just really basic stuff, but came up to Oregon, took some classes, is very fluent in English, can even read English, which is terrific for us. Started with Sokol Blosser Vineyard in 1988 as a tractor driver, and became, by the 1990s, our vineyard manager. And now, from those humble beginnings, he's also a contractor. He works for a number of vineyards. He has brought up not only, well, all of the people who work for him are either from his hometown or his wife's hometown. And Bill Blosser went back to Mexico and visited the hometown, and everybody knew Luis. Everybody remembered Luis. He's a success story in his hometown. In fact, I think he's building a retirement house there. So he is, that's the American dream. He has done very well. He's gets a new truck often. And his kids are doing well. His daughters are in college. It's a beautiful thing. And the people that work for him, he's very good to them, and they are good workers. So during the course of the 80s and 90s, there were also contractors who were not good to their workers. We were aware of that, so we were pretty careful to try and find people who were good.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and fit in with the Sokol Blosser team and general feeling too. I know you and some of the other wineries have worked really hard to try and make sure that it was a very supportive environment, and I know there's been a lot of success stories for you.
Well, there are personal success stories like Ophelia and Luis, but I have to say there are still, there's a separate society that, as much as we would like to include our vineyard crew in the things that we do, it's not the same, and they feel uncomfortable. And we have a big dinner with them every year, but it's basically me and my son Alex, and they bring their wives and kids, and we have a good time, but they are more comfortable in their own society, and we have not been able to bridge that, and I think that's a challenge that's ahead of us. We can bridge it on an individual basis, but as a group, that's been difficult.
Okay.
Partly there's a language barrier. I mean, that's a lot of Luis's crew don't speak English, so there's a lot of smiling.
Right.
But smiles work.
Definitely.
So just to start off, can you kind of tell us about your involvement with Salute?
Well, I forget the exact date that Salute was started, but the idea was that we are so dependent on our Latino workers who did not have health care, that we wanted to help them. And so a group of wineries got together, and with the leadership of some of the doctors in the area, and decided to raise money through a special auction, which we called the Salute auction. And Sokol Blosser was one of the original wineries that participated in that. And that program has really grown tremendously, and we provide quite a few wonderful healthcare clinics and mobile clinics. They come to Sokol Blosser Vineyard and actually see people here. The challenge is that we were able to give our employees health care. So Luis, who was an employee of ours, had health care, but his crew, who he hired, did not have health care, and that was the challenge, to provide health care for people who didn't fit in the regular system. And a number of vineyards weren't able to do health care even for their employees, so they helped with that.
So how has the mission of Salute evolved over time?
Well, that's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm not on the board, I'm not directly involved. I think the mission of Salute started to provide basic health care, and I think it's expanded as the needs have expanded. But I can't give you any particulars. But I know you interviewed someone who could.
Can you kind of speak to what the first years of Salute were like? Was there support in the community? Was it hard to get it going?
Well, it was like any big event where you're talking about getting big money. Mm-hmm. It was hard to get going, and I don't know what we raised the first year, but it's significantly less than now, and people come from all over the country now to bid on these very special barrels of Pinot Noir. And also the reputation that Oregon has for Pinot Noir is much higher now than it was when we started, excuse me, so that people are interested in a way that they weren't when we just started.
When you were gathering initial support, how was it received by other wineries that weren't involved directly, and then also just the wider community?
Well, the few wineries who started, and I don't remember how many there were especially chosen. And as the event became more prestigious, everybody wanted to be part of it. And so they have taken on more wineries, and they've done fundraising in other ways with wineries that aren't part of it. And I think it was received well by the community as a very worthy cause. I love the story of Mario, who has worked with us for a number of years as one of our top cellar worker, and is a big Lakers fan, comes from Tijuana, and no, not Tijuana, Tecate. is Tecate beer from Tijuana? Well, anyway, you can ask him. But the story that I love is that Mario started studying to get his American citizenship. And Russ, the winemaker, said, okay, Mario, who is the president of the United States? And Mario said, John Wayne. So I love that, you know, that he was imbued with the popular culture, just had a few details to work out, but just I think this last year, within the last 2 years, got his American citizenship, so it's pretty neat.
Good.
Yeah, that's my story. Well, actually, one other thing I want to say about Mario is that he's part of the production team, and he is fully integrated into the Sokol Blosser family. And I think that speaks to when someone works around all the other employees, it's much easier to have that family feeling. And the issue with the vineyard crew is that they're really separate, that they don't interface with the sales and marketing and production that much. So that's where in any, that's not an issue necessarily of Latino, it's an issue of separation. So that would be another perspective. Okay, that's it.
Okay, no, thank you.
Oh, but I'm glad you're going to